Welcome back to this special episode of To The Point and a one-hour program on the Chinese president's visit to India. Ambassador, let's come to politics and let's begin with the border problem that's bedeviled our relationship for at least 50 years, if not more. Although India hasn't appointed a new special representative, the institution has seen 17 rounds of talks. And that's been the case since Mr. Vajpayee's time. And yet the problem is by no means solved. So I'm going to ask you a simple question that I think occurs to many people. Is the problem intractable, or does it just require a lot of time and patience?
It requires a lot of time and patience. Every territorial dispute requires time and patience to resolve it. These are very difficult issues.
And they still can't solve it?
There are border issues which have lasted for much longer than that. There are territorial disputes which have continued for centuries and have not impaired good relations between the parties concerned. Look at Gibraltar.
All right. Let me put it like this, Pramit Chaudhary. There's a view that because of China growing steadily stronger as a country year by year, and because the differential between the two countries is growing greater year by year, time works to China's advantage rather than India's. Do you agree with that view?
Well, let's put it this way. What we have seen definitely with China, he was mentioning that we have very old territorial disputes. The fact is China has resurrected very non-existent territorial disputes. For example, the South China Sea, which it's never really had a claim on and never really made a noise about, but suddenly in the past 10 years it's exploded as possibly one of the key territorial demands of the Chinese.
And that's because it's a stronger country and can create disputes because it thinks it's in a position to push its way.
Yeah, most of the sinologists I've met say there's a very clear thing called the Shanghai School of Foreign Policy, which argues that China is now will be the dominant Asian power for the next 30 years at least. And this is our chance. Why are we sitting around and waiting?
So time is not on India's side. Time, if you delay sorting out this problem, gives China an added advantage with every year.
Well, if you continue to assume that India does badly.
Well, that's been the track record so far, hasn't it?
So far for the past 5-6 years, yeah.
Sanjay Bhatt, I want to bring you in both as a strategist, also as an economist. Given the trajectory of the Indian economy and given the fact that Mr. Modi perhaps is determined to push our growth rates back to 8 and 9%, and given the fact that China has maintained growth rates over 30 years pretty close to 8%, is time on China's side when it comes to sorting out the border dispute? Do we need to move quickly to find a solution so that India doesn't lose out? Or am I being needlessly pessimistic?
No, time is certainly need not be only on China's side. Time can easily be on our side if we, get our act together. But don't forget that by and large, the world is on India's side. I mean, we have a large number of friends around the world. And I think the challenge for India is to maintain these relationships. And not to create kind of wariness about India's rise that China has created. I mean, the fact is that Chinese assertiveness has kind of created unease in Asia, and our own rise should not create that kind of unease, because China and India are destined to rise.
But the fact that the fact that the West is sanguine about India's rise may not give India any advantage in sorting out a border dispute with China.
Absolutely. I'm not saying the West will give us any advantages. In fact, the West will not give you any advantage. All I'm saying is that we are not going to be left high and dry if there were a dispute. And I don't think we should allow such situations to arise.
Rajan, you may have noticed on several TV channels that in fact there was a certain belief, a certain hope that because the two prime ministers are new, because they had such a successful meeting in Brazil, they're going to be able to sort out the border between them, just give them a couple of years to do so. Is that a case of exaggerated hope rather than realistic expectation? Or do you really think these two gentlemen, because they're so powerful, because they're new, can break the trend of the last 50 years?
Well, they certainly have the political capacity to do so, I think. A settlement as and when it comes will be traumatic, certainly for us in India, even if most analysts would gladly trade maintain the status quo, which would mean a change of the nature of the map. If there's any leader who could push that through in India, it's Mr. Modi, I guess. But I think that settlement of the boundary will involve painstaking negotiations. I'm surprised that the government hasn't yet named a a special representative. My own view, Karan, is that time actually favors India. I think the longer this issue is kicked down the road, the relative difference in military and economic strength will decrease, the demographic dividend of India will kick in. And the other important point is that we should not make the mistake of assuming that countries that we are friends with, that we have partnerships with, like Japan or the US, are going to fight our border dispute battles with the Chinese. They're not going to do it. Prime Minister Modi went to Japan and spoke about Chinese encroachment in seas. Have you heard any statement from Mr. Abe about the Chinese incursion in Ladakh? Right? So we should be careful about the fact that it is ultimately down to Indian defenses. I think the fact that we don't have a full-time Raksha Mantri is a problem. I think these are things that we need to, it's through this method that we will safeguard our territory rather than, thinking that alliances or being on the good side of the US or Japan is going to deliver. It's not going to do that.
Anand Krishnan, in the past, including reportedly even sometime in the 80s, China was willing to trade off concessions in Arunachal Pradesh against concessions made by India in Ladakh. Now, that's no longer on the table, but many believe that it might still be the most practical solution. Is there any possibility of that idea being revived from the Beijing end?
I think in China, in the last few years, we've seen the emergence of this trope of recovering lost territories. I think in the 1980s, it might have been something that's on the table. But now you hear a lot of analysts, including those some believe to be close to Mr. Xi, talking about 3 territories that they've lost. One is the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands. Then the other is the South China Sea, and the third is Arunachal Pradesh, which they call South Tibet. So the way the Chinese propaganda machinery has kicked up references to Arunachal Pradesh in the last 10 years, I think that will be something very difficult to imagine now.
Okay. Analysts like Brahma Chalani, Ambassador Das Gupta, often talk about a Tibet card that India could play. My feeling personally is that if we had to play it, we should have played it in the 50s. This is now half a century today. But is there any shape and form of a Tibet card that we could play that Mr. Modi may be more willing to chance his luck around, unlike, say, Dr. Manmohan Singh?
I don't believe there's any such thing as a Tibet card. What precisely is the leverage that we get out of Chinese difficulties in Tibet? I don't think it gives us leverage, and we have to be careful. We have followed a very correct policy so far of ensuring that there are no hostile activities carried out from our soil against China.
Attempting to play the Tibet card would ruin that track record.
Absolutely.
Pramipal Chaudhary, connected with the border issue is in fact the visa issue as well. Is there any possibility that the visa issue can be resolved to our satisfaction whilst the border, which is the bigger, deeper problem, continues to be a problem?
Well, the Kashmir visa, actually, we did solve it in the sense that the Chinese have now pulled it back, and we used a Tibet card to stop them. That was exactly how we did it. In 2008, 2009, when we started to see a really severe slide in our relationship on a whole host of areas in which the Kashmir visa was really probably the most potent issue, because it signaled a change, in our view, China's policy on Kashmir. How did India force the Chinese to go back? We increased our military exercises with the United States to the point that we were America's #1 military exercise partner in the world, even more than NATO. We expelled over 25,000 Chinese from India. The Chinese still didn't back down. What did we eventually do? We basically told them behind closed doors, you don't change, if you change the Kashmir policy or you don't go back to what it originally was, we change our Tibet policy without specifying what it was.
And that sort of language China listens to?
Yes, because they are terrified of the Dalai Lama.
So then you're saying there is a Tibet card that we could use?
But it's a very one that can only use very rarely, because there is an element of bluff in it. But it's one that the Chinese will accept if you play it in a certain circumstance. And they basically they seem to have come to understand that what they think about Tibet, we think about Kashmir. They understand that equation, and they backed off. It worked.
So you're answering 2 questions for me at one go. A, you're answering the question I put to Ambassador Das Gupta, that there is a Tibet card, but it can be used only in very limited circumstances. It has to be used with great cleverness and finesse,
yes,
because essentially they can call your bluff on it.
Yep.
But the second thing you're also answering is that the Arunachal visa issue, which is the one that lingers, can presumably be sorted out even while the bigger border problem continues.
Arunachal is slightly different because that's been a standard policy that's been going all the way back to the 1950s, and we have never protested it until more recently. So we have effectively accepted the Arunachal visa policy. What we opposed was the Kashmir visa because we said that's something new.
In other words, have we left it too late to protest about Arunachal now?
Yeah, it looks very strange for us to do it now because they can rightly say, but you've been allowing us to do this for a very long time.
So this is one we've mishandled. Would you agree with that, Ambassador?
No, I think the Chinese policy regarding visas for Indian citizens hailing from Arunachal Pradesh is a totally illogical policy. It doesn't make sense even in terms of Chinese...
Except the point Pramit Pal Chaudhary is making is that we accepted it for many, many years. Now to suddenly quarrel about it, the Chinese will turn around and say, what's the problem? You've accepted it for decades.
We've been protesting against this for several years now. It's
so you disagree with Pramit? You disagree with Pramit?
I think yes, on that I do.
Very quickly,
now
Pramit,
let me explain why I think it's
before you go further. Are your facts wrong? Because this is entirely a question of facts.
Well, I would argue that we have basically had an understanding, well, an understanding be a strong word, but we've understood that the Chinese will repeatedly reject anybody with an Arunachal, Indian from Arunachal Pradesh and say you're not an Indian citizen, you're Chinese. And we have essentially said, okay, we will pull back anybody who runs into this issue, but after that we're not going to go any further.
Okay.
But Kashmir was a different issue. I would argue there we said this is completely unacceptable. We will not.
Let's move on. Sanjay Baru, I want to broaden the discussion and talk about, in fact, the conflicting roles or the perception of conflicting roles played by India and China in the wider region. And my concern is this: despite whatever economic cooperation Delhi and Beijing may establish with each other, and it may well be very close, do we not also remain rival powers in Asia? And if that is the case, how do you, as a strategist, view China's role in countries like Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Bangladesh, Burma, Nepal, all of which, in a way, form a sort of garland chain around India? And in all of them, China is stepping up not just its political and economic relationship, but also its strategic interests.
You know, Karan, I wrote a paper in 2000 when I was at ICRIER, which is part of my book, showing that from 1991 to 1999, China emerged as the first trade partner of all our neighbors. In 1990, India was the #1 trade partner of all its neighbors except Pakistan. By 1999, China had become the #1 trade partner of all our neighbors, including Nepal. So that change is long gone.
#1 trading partner.
China is 5 times bigger than India. There will be competition. But I think that the challenge for the two countries is to manage that competition. As Manmohan Singh used to say, you know, the relationship has to be characterized by both cooperation and competition. In third markets, we will compete. You know, President Xi Jinping wrote this article, I think, in the Hindu yesterday, where he said China will be the workshop of the world and India will be the back office of the world. Hello, India cannot afford not to be the workshop also. You know, we need a manufacturing sector.
If only we could get our act together, as you said.
Jobs.
You're right, absolutely,
Exactly.
we need to get
So
our
that's
act
our
together.
challenge.
But Anand Krishnan, I want to put this to you. We're not just talking about competition and cooperation, we're also talking about the possibility that China might want to surround India with a series of alliances or relationships, use whatever noun you wish, that will prevent India emerging as a dominant political rival to China. Is there a sense in which you perceive that the Chinese leadership wishes to contain India's ambitions or prevent their full realization? Maybe that's a more acceptable way of phrasing it.
I think it was interesting that when Xi Jinping was in the Maldives earlier this week, he wrote an article for a local newspaper in which he described the Maldives as a string of pearls, which I thought was a really funny choice of phrase because we've been so worried of China building a string of pearls. I don't know if his advisors had some meaning in the use of that phrase, but I think they have stepped up their presence in all the countries surrounding India. And this past week has been a bit of a coup for Xi Jinping because he got the Maldives and Sri Lanka to publicly voice their backing for this Maritime Silk Road project, which Xi Jinping has been championing. And I think the very purpose of this Maritime Silk Road project is to sort of establish a deeper and permanent Chinese economic presence in the region. So I think it's possible that 10 years ago, maybe they treaded a little carefully because of India's sensitivities, but I think that's no longer the case now.
Siddharth Varadarajan, that phrase, garland of pearls, reminds me of George Fernandez, who, when he was defense minister, just days before the Chinese defense minister visited this country, described China as potential threat #1. And he was particularly concerned about what he called a string of pearls, a series of Chinese military or quasi-military installations stretching right across Tibet, Bangladesh, Burma, down to Sri Lanka, up through the Arakan coast in Pakistan, all of which he felt surrounded India, and he sometimes wondered whether this string of pearls wasn't looking a bit like a noose. Were those unrealistic fears? Or do you feel that perhaps behind China's economic interests could also lie strategic interests, and given that we are rivals, this could well be something China has up its sleeve, even if it doesn't publicly talk about it?
Well, the phrase string of pearls goes back to the Rand Corporation, their assessment of what Chinese grand strategy in the Indian Ocean region is. I think that we have to be very clear about what are these facilities that the Chinese are creating. Are they military facilities? Is Hambantota a military port? It's not. Is the maritime Silk Route something that's meant to be military? So far, there's no indication that that's the case. So if so you have there's one ocean. There are sea lanes of communication. India occupies an excellent vantage point in the Indian Ocean. A lot of Chinese shipping goes through the Indian Ocean. It's logical that the Chinese would want to take measures to ensure the continuity of their sea lanes, of their transport routes, and India has a role to play as a net provider of security in the region. Okay. I don't think we need to worry too much about this. Of course, if there are military dimensions, I think India has enough clout, enough influence with its neighboring countries to ensure that the Chinese presence does not go in that direction. So I don't think we need to lose sleep over this. I think we need to be watchful, but we shouldn't let our worries and concerns override Indian participation in a project that is of potential benefit to all maritime powers.
I want to stop you there. I want to stop you there because, in fact, I see Pramit Pal Chaudhary's head nodding. I'm not sure whether he's nodding in agreement or disagreement, but if it's disagreement, I want him to have a chance to voice it before we end the show.
Well, just two things. I agree that the string of pearls is exaggerated. As somebody, I think Shiv Shankar Menon used to say, string of pearls when you play the game Clue, is a string of pearls a murder weapon? No. However...
And it's a very pretty sight around the neck of a woman. But I don't think that's what the Chinese have in mind either.
But, however, the claim that we are in a position to necessarily negate Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean, I disagree. Within Africa, China is far ahead of us now. Including even littoral African countries like South Africa, Tanzania, and Kenya. They are not particularly close to India, or definitely less close to India than they are. And even in Southeast Asia, countries like Malaysia, for example, very clearly see China as the future. They don't see India as being part of their strategic vision at all. And there are many other places in the Indian Ocean, including the Persian Gulf and so on, where you go there to those countries and they say, the future used to be America. America seems to be gone, so we think the future is China. And then what about India? Oh, yeah, well, you're around too, but you're not really a strategic.
So in a very substantial sense, China has just outstripped us as far as strategic perceptions of the world.
This is an economy that's 4 times larger than ours.
Given the context of the discussion we've just been having, given what you've heard from Pramit, but also what you've heard from Siddharth and Sanjay Baru, how should India respond to President Xi's vision of a maritime Silk Road?
I don't like the term Silk Road because it is Sino-centric. But I think it's extremely important that we develop maritime connections, trade, shipping, and so on, in our neighborhood, in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific areas. And we should certainly cooperate in international, regional efforts in this direction. But I don't see why it should be called a Silk Route, because that's excessively Sino-centric.
But they probably dreamt up the word, that's why they want to use a Sino-centric term.
They didn't dream it up. Actually, it was a German writer in the 19th century who coined the term Silk Route.
All right. Let me put it like this, Sanjay Baru. One of the things that in fact has happened in the last few days is that ONGC Videsh has signed a pact with Vietnam to explore for oil in the South China Sea. China has concerns about this, and their spokesman has made it clear that they will be particularly concerned if that exploration is happening in waters that China claims sovereign control over. Is this a potential flashpoint waiting to happen in the future?
You know, I link it to your string of pearls question. A friend of mine, I don't want to name him, is a Chinese professor in Beijing, once said to me, you know, look at our string of pearls. We have Pakistan, we have Myanmar, we have Sri Lanka, you know. Look at your string of pearls. You have Vietnam, you have Japan, you know, you have even Russia. I mean, you have much better string of pearls than we have. And it's true. I mean, we need to build these strategic relations with Vietnam, with Japan, not in order to gang up against China, but to be able to show that, you know, if they twist our arm, we can also do something that should be, make them anxious.
A quick last question, both to Siddharth Varadarajan and Anand Krishnan, and I'm going to ask the same thing to both of you, and I'm going to ask you to give me really short answers because we're out of time. Where do you see the relationship between the two countries at the end of Mr. Modi's first term, 5 years from now? First, Siddharth.
I think if they can deliver, if they can find a way to deliver on some of these economic promises, and you see a substantial increase in Chinese investment, and if the balance of trade is addressed, I think that that puts the relationship on a very sound footing. I don't personally see any prospect of the boundary issue being resolved, however. I think they have, we have to find a way to
I'm going to stop you there.
I'm going to
stop you there. That's a short, sharp answer. Anand Krishnan, an equally short, sharp one. How do you see the relationship at the end of Mr. Modi's first term?
I think we see greater focus on trade and investment, but no breakthroughs on the boundary.
Greater focus on trade and investment, but no breakthroughs on the boundary. So the relationship over our disputed borders is going to continue to bedevil us. And regardless of whether the string of pearls adorns Madam Peng's neck or is a noose around India's borders, the string of pearls is also going to be something that we're going to be talking about. Well, it's always nice to introduce a bit of jewelry into geography. My thanks to all my guests for joining me. And if you have been, thanks for watching. Goodbye. Good night.